Hi, welcome back again. And this is our first panel for the day. And we're going to unpack the dynamics of ESG, the key issues around ESG standards and metrics and ratings, and some of the key considerations that we think are going to be important into the future. For this, I have with me Wim. Wim, could you introduce yourself?
Yes, hello everybody. My name is Wim Schoutens. I'm from Belgium, an academic working at the Department of Mathematics at the University of Leuven. And my research is about risk management, financial products, financial markets, also now about a bit saying about sustainable finance. Have been writing books on several kind of issues, typically on tail risks, non-normal distributed stuff. I have been in regards to this topic, doing a few papers on ESG myself, and yeah, I'll happy to share my feelings about that later in this conversation.
Great. And Iancu?
Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to join you. I'm Iancu Daramus. I'm a sustainable investment specialist. I've been working on launching sustainability solutions at various asset management firms. I've worked on shareholder engagement, trying to influence some of the world's largest companies through your voice as shareholders. I also research and write about the energy transition, including as one of the lead authors of the CFA certificate in ESG investing, looking at the climate chapter of it. So I'm looking forward to the discussion today. Thank you.
Thank you both. As you can see, we have two experts to cover a broad range of themes that we're going to cover today, including from the quantitative side to what's happening in the market and so on, with all and so forth. So, with no further ado, I'm going to dive right in. First of all, Wim, how important is standardization in enabling adoption in the ESG ratings and metrics space? How important is the fact that we can have standard structures in enabling data and data that goes into investment and credit decisions, if you will? Wim?
Okay, I go first now. Let then
Yeah.
myself put the scene a little bit. I think we should not adopt ESG ratings in investment and credit decisions. That's my conclusion. So I'm also definitely not for standardization. In essence, I think ESG rating and everything that comes along with it is a kind of invention of bureaucrats, academics, blame myself, politicians and activists, of which most of them have never worked in industry, nor in investment banking or risk management. And they are, to some extent, just instruments to push a certain political agenda. And that's not what the task of risk management and investing is about. They are pushing a kind of view of how to organize the world. And that's fine that such views exist, but this is a view, and this is a view that probably not every investment person or investor follows. So I think you should not adopt that per se as a given. Of course, you can open yourself for conversations with investors if they think it's important. But whether you should do that as a standard, I don't think so. Personally, and I'm just putting it very sharp, I think this whole ESG comes with a lot of hypocrisy, virtue signaling, and a kind of authoritarian flavor that I don't like. Now, I want to give the whole kind of thing a little bit the benefit of the doubt. And one could say that having data on all ESG aspects could be maybe helpful in whatever, bring transparency towards risks And to some extent, I agree there. Of course, I wonder and I worry about if I invest in a company, what is its policy towards a little bit broader, polluting the air, polluting the seas, and so on, because this could be of importance for the economical situation of that company. But making then it standardized, like it was part of your question, would actually only fuel greenwashing to my extent. Because then it will become a tick of the box object. Kind of, let's make sure that for the standardized kind of criterion, we look for an optimization, which in essence has nothing to do with the reality. It is an additional cost, an administrative burden, and will maintain, I think, a whole army of consultants flying around the world, explaining which boxes should be ticked and which not. And I think we have forgotten about risks. If I go to conferences and I think back 10 years ago, we had conversations of all kinds of risks, all kinds of aspects of risks. And now at some conferences, 70, 80% of the talks are about politics. And I think we have disentangled ourselves from risk management way too much. Okay, I leave it by that. I spare some other ammunition for later.
That's very interesting perspectives. Iancu, how do you react to that?
Well, that was a very broad salvo. There's a lot in there. I'd start with one important clarification to me, not just because of grammar. I think we should stop saying ESG and full stop. ESG is not a noun, it's an adjective. ESG what? Risks, opportunities, impact, all of these things. This is not picking words. It matters what word you add after, because depending on that, you will think and talk about different things. And most obviously, the difference between ESG inputs and ESG outputs, I think, runs through the entire conversation, and different people are approaching it in different ways. So maybe we'll come to that a bit later. Now, I would say two things. I agree with Wim on the point that there are aspects which could be interpreted probably as political, or more importantly, that there are certain cases where both individual views will inevitably color the issue, and there's no way to hope to standardize that. Obvious example in non-ESG land, bank ratings, sell-side ratings, right? Whether or not a company is rated as a buy or seller as a hold, that's actually not really correlated. And probably that's the point. Different analysts will come to different views on what a company is. Similarly here, if we separate two kinds of potential avenues for standardization, one is what I'd call the factual question. So what is a company's level of carbon emissions, for example? That's one kind of question. And there is a lot of standardization going on in that space, and there probably should be to a degree, not unlike, what does the company say, revenues. There's some standardization happening for a long time there. Now, however, when you try to move from this factual question to a more interpretive question, like, is this company a sustainable company, given its level of emissions, then we are in interpretive territory. And I think this is the point where confusion may reign, and where attempts to standardize actually cannot, almost conceptually, they cannot work, because we're talking about elements which, to a degree, are relative. I'm not going to say subjective necessarily, because it's not completely up for grabs. But my point is that, obviously, how you look, for example, the same, look at an oil company, for example, you know what its emissions are. Say standardization has really helped you get more clarity on what its emissions are, fine. But the extent to which you judge that a given ton of carbon is a unit of risk, that is something for investors to decide. It's not, to me, something that regulators can standardize. Now, I worry, though, that on both sides of the equation, sometimes both proponents feel that standardization will help things. If only we had standards, then finally, for example, money would flow to climate solutions. And I don't think that's the case, because you always have the issue, given a particular standard or data point, how much weight to put on it. And that's something that's a decision that rests with the investor, not with the data. So people who sort of help, if we had the standards, then all sorts of things would follow. I don't think that's necessarily true. And the flip side too, particularly in some parts of the pushback, people say like, oh, if these ratings are standardized, then companies face this huge burden and they're saddled and no one will invest in them. Again, I don't think that's quite true. because the choice of what to take and which data points to use, and if we're talking fund construction, okay, there is a standardized data point. Do I put it into the fund? How much do I allow it to upweight or downweight the company? All of these are questions which are not standardizable. So that is sort of my take. There are points where standardization can help, but I don't think we should put too much hope in it, either on the plus side or the downside, really.
Okay, so I think there are that's really interesting points both of you have made, and I think there are two distinct questions. I mean, one is, do you standardize the risk management framework, and do you and obviously any standardization brings along a point of view of the world along with it. And secondly, to what extent do you let institutions, banks, financial organizations make their own decisions? And now this is obviously there is need for a greater degree of flexibility, or a large amount of flexibility. But besides whatever one's personal opinions may be, and this is a question I want to throw back at both of you. If you look at what happened in financial risk, in market risk, the market risk industry, somewhat driven by regulators, somewhat driven by each other, sort of adopted VAR as a model of how it would quantify risk. Now, this isn't neutral. VAR as a computational technique isn't neutral in itself. It does go against certain kinds of assets, maybe long held, less liquid, whatever, and uh, it sort of embodies a certain point of view, but it is relatively simple to calculate. It brings everything into one common framework and allows regulators and institutions to start understanding each other as they are talking across and the investors as well. Is there something that is needed like that? Perhaps not across ESG, but maybe in one segment of it, i.e., climate, where there's a lot of quantitative data available. Anyway, for that, quick, Wim, what would be your response to that? Do you need some kind of standard risk management framework, if not standard data sets, if not standard inputs, but at least a standard structure? Or you think that too is too problematic given the relative immaturity of the data and the analytical universe in this space?
Yeah, it's all about what you mean with standardization. I prefer to some extent to have the raw data, because as Iancu was saying, aggregating a lot of data in a standardized way makes a decision on weights, and actually you lose a lot of information by standardization. So for me, whether it is about emissions, whether it's about how many actions you have to create transparency on the boards or something, give me the raw numbers. If you want to give me something, give me the raw numbers. And this is what an analyst should do anyway. An analyst will not look purely to input output of this is what I bring into the factory, this is what comes out to the factory. You will always see it as a kind of a bigger kind of scope, and everything matters in doing business, in entrepreneurships. And so then you have to make your own decision. This is what makes an analysis a good one or a bad one. So in that perspective, I'm trusting on the raw data and not by pre-prepared data. It's kind of like food. I prefer to cook with the ingredients myself in contrast to pre-prepared food. I have my own flavors which I want to balance and not just eat what is served for and produced for the menu.
Yes, but just a quick follow-up question. Do you think there should be a recipe? I.e., this is how you're going to work through the food. This is the overarching model. This is the way you transmit the raw or the emissions data into credit risk. Do you think there should be something like that? And if so, at what level, if there is going to be any of that?
I think people will make their recipes. Let people make their recipes. I like grandmother kitchen, so let every grandmother makes their own recipe, and probably it's a good recipe. Let us not make politicians or academics or other kind of experts decide on that. That's what I'm saying, kind of, it has an authoritarian flavor. We should have our own flavor, not kind of imposed by others.
Understood. Iancu, your response.
Well, I was thinking, particularly on the climate bit, probably there have been some forays into something like you're describing with this idea of stress testing and climate stress testing, right? That's probably one area which comes close. Indeed, there are some people literally trying to do climate value at risk models. Now, I share some of your concerns, and the recipe analogy is interesting because I remember particularly when the Bank of England and the PRA were first looking at this issue. The way they went about it, particularly in the UK, although they put guardrails in terms of sandbox and things, was basically saying, look, here is this list of assumptions for what GDP would look like, for temperature, for various things, and then tell us how your assets, say for an insurer, would look against this scenario. But the problem was, of course, that for different people will cook different recipes, and for some firms, certain parameters would be inputs, and for others, those would be outputs in the way they do their own, like cooking, if you will. So I understand where this comes from. It comes from the attempt to create a common baseline, but the challenge is in practice, if you specify too much, it becomes an exercise that's divorced from the way capital is actually allocated. And I see that in particular with the fact that when people do try to force, say, the choice of specific scenarios, understandably, again, they look at what might be perhaps out of the not a central scenario. That's the point of doing a stress test. You choose something a bit more extreme, but I worry that they choose the wrong extremes. In particular, either an extreme where, say, global warming just keeps going and going and going, and the Earth turns to Venus this century, and it's like, that's not going to happen, partly because we've had climate policies that are slightly curbing that emission. So we're not going to turn into Venus. There's not that much point modeling climate catastrophe that is unlikely to happen in that timeline. So that's one kind of side of climate gone haywire. And the other one is also improbable in a different way, which is this kind of global idealized scenario where every country chips in and everything works perfectly in line, and all the countries of the world achieve net zero in 2050 in a perfectly harmonious way. That also is not likely to happen in that timeline, I think. So in a way, you're doing a kind of stress testing, or you're mandating stress testing against scenarios which are in different ways improbable. I'm also interested in actually slightly differently, what is the central scenario and how far away are you from that? And how does that map against other people's central scenario? I think that's a very interesting conversation. And it's also interesting, I think, because of how that conversation has shifted, i.e., if you think of certain clean tech penetration, for example, where people thought we would be 10 years ago is vastly miles away from where we actually ended on the positive side. So, what you're actually modeling as the central case is an interesting point to start for me, and it's more interesting than modeling extremes, which might not necessarily pan out in the way in which it's sometimes mandated.
I think the point that you make about central case and what everyone else is doing, etc., is a very powerful and important one. But what do you think about the fact that actually for certain aspects of climate risk, there is a market for it, in the sense that there is an insurance market for climate risk, and there is also, in some ways, for energy products, the prices and what the demand is going to be over time, there is a market for it. So besides central risk, do you think that there should be an idea that people should be trying to align their predictions or their use cases or their scenarios and stress environments with what is actually available in the market, what the market is saying?
That's a very interesting question, and it has many lines. I mean, one of it, as you pointed out, is indeed that there exists, particularly as around catastrophe risk, a well-established market. So you could say that regulators will not know that market better than the participants themselves. Probably true for commodity markets to a degree as well. But I do go back to my first job working on sustainability was for a think tank called Carbon Tracker. And if you know them, they first introduced the analysis of stranded assets as a concept applied to energy markets. And when they were first publishing the reports, I remember specifically every single company and every energy company was saying, What are you talking about? No such thing as stranded asset. We know demand is robust to 2050, keeps going, all that kind of stuff. Fast forward a few years later, and one of the oil majors literally had in one of their press releases, one of their write down and saying, yeah, this asset is now a stranded asset, this particularly high carbon asset. So what I'm trying to say by this is that there is an element potentially of groupthink, I think, that is happening here. And obviously, the range of uncertainty grows so wildly. Something like, what is the trajectory of oil demand, for example? Pick energy forecasters, oil companies, and you'll see a huge range, right, between what is possible to happen. I'm not 100% sure that you can say, well, you can just find a pricing contract that will meet you. Because sometimes this is government money going there. Sometimes it's shareholder money. I think you can't just fully say, you should kind of let the market solve it. I'm not saying that's what you said exactly, but that is the way I think how it could be interpreted.
Wim, your response to that?
Yeah, to some extent, I agree there. And I think it's related to also the emission trading and the emission accounting, I think, and it has to do also with the models. There were two aspects there on which I want to comment that were put in the stress case scenarios. Now, this is a little bit my real domain of analysis at the Met department. It's about model risk. And I think we have here a tremendous model risk in every of the models that we are using. We are projecting 50 years away from now on certain models which have their own kind of special things in it. These are non-linear chaotic models. We all know how difficult it is to get a stable solution of a three-dimensional partial differential equation system. Now, this is full of partial differential equations which are non-linear connected, where also the inputs are quite uncertain. So you have to deal here with a lot of model risk. So predicting things in scenarios always you have to be very, very, very careful about that. In trading on cat bonds, I think there is information, and actually I think these people, because they have really skin in the game, know very well what is happening, and let them function. I think that is bringing transparency to the market and is also giving right tools to well, if you want to hedge your risks away. In terms of emission trading, which is also related to that, I think quite a bit of it is based on smoke and mirrors. Because what are you really trading? It reminds me a little bit to the subprime crisis, where people were trading very sophisticated products and nobody could really make the connection anymore with the real world. But here we are trading what? Equivalence of CO2 emissions for what? And what does that mean in that price? And I think regulators don't take enough into account in their scenarios the following kind of thing. I think there is a certain tail risk here that maybe this emission trading system, and particularly in Europe, in the middle term could be abandoned. Why? Because in essence, all this carbon emission trading and additional costs that is put on for the industry is creating quite a bit of an economic handicap for Europe. It's strangling parts of the economy, whereas the rest of the world is just going on. And that means that the prices will go up for consumers, which creates inflation, and people start calling it greenflation. Now, it's therefore not unthinkable that politicians who see that, who there kind of see the damages in the industrial production in Europe happening, and then if you bring it down to, well, it has to do with all this carbon emission trading things that just makes everything more expensive for their voters, it could be that they just say, let's forget about it. And then you have your schemes and you have your portfolio of your emission certificates, and they're basically worth zero. So we have to be careful there also. There is also systemic risk on the other side, that maybe this emission trading system could break down because it's just an economic handicap for people, for countries and industries who implement this.
No, thank you. That is very interesting. I mean, we can talk about this for a very long time. It's a complex subject with many risks. And as you clearly and very eloquently brought out, there are risks on all sides of the equation, risks on doing too much, risks on doing too less, risks on doing anything for that matter, because your models are themselves complicated and take in a lot of complex data. We could also talk a little bit about the state of the data, which is complex, but we're running out of time, and would love to continue this conversation. But with that, key themes here, that there's risks on all sides, very hard to standardize, and there's a lot of risks in the models themselves. Thank you both. It's been a very interesting session.